Today we are going to introduce Chapter 1, which gives us an introduction to science and an introduction to biology. So the science word actually means in Latin to know. And so when we talk about science, it's a process of trying to figure out and explain the natural world around us. Biology, ology is study of, and bio is life, is the study of life. And so, what we want to look at in this chapter is both what is the process of science and then how do we define biology. So, one thing that I like to do with all of our PowerPoints and all of our chapters is to really ask, what does this have to do with me? Why do I have to learn about this? What's the point? And so, if you've ever wondered why something is the way it is, and then you come up with an answer, you have done science. You have gone through the process of science. Unique things in nature can be explained by science. And even when we don't know exactly how it happens, we can at least narrow things down to maybe why it was. We talk about different planets that we have in the solar system. How do we know why they were formed? How do we know what they're made of? Well, a lot of those planets we've never been to, but we're able to use things that we know on a smaller scale and then use it to apply to something on a larger scale or something that we don't know a lot about. And then other things, more like real life, is if you like being outside, if you like cooking, there's a ton of science in sports. There's a lot of science in music. If you have pets, if you like gardening, if you're into agriculture, I'm not just saying this as a science being biased towards science, but it really is everywhere. And it's something that you can always find an avenue to relate science to our real life. So when we look at curious things like this, so here we have a bunch of raccoons, and we notice that there's four what we would call maybe normal one, actually five normal ones, and then we have this one that is white. So the first thing that we do in the process of science is we observe something. Then we start to question why. Then we try to come up with our own reason or hypothesis. And then from there, we try to experiment and design to see if we are right. And then from there, we might adjust our hypothesis, we might adjust how we run an experiment. And so we'll talk about this a lot. We call science a process. It's not a one-way street. It's not a start and end destination. Sometimes we have to cycle back or restart the process as well. When we look at hot springs in Yellowstone and we see, not only the steam come off, so we're like, okay, that makes sense. We have steam coming off. It's hot stuff rises. We get steam off water. But if we look at specifically the colors that are around it and why those colors are so vivid, again, we're asking our question, why is it? And then we try to come up with an explanation. Why are there arches in some of our national parks? Not just Arches National Parks, but there's actually a lot of areas that have arches or have unique rock formations. And we can't take a time machine and go back and fast forward it and watch how this happens. So we have to create models and then try to apply those models to explain scenarios that we maybe can't see with the naked eye. And so our process again starts with an observation. So seeing something unique. Maybe it's how different chemicals react. Maybe it's how lobsters are in different colors, the albino raccoon, the arches that we see. And so we observe something and then we try to question why is it that way? Or, it could be a feeling. It could be why do we see something? Why is something the way that it is? And then we try to come up with our own reason why it might be. The key with a hypothesis is that it's got to be testable. If you can't test it, then it's really hard to say, oh, this happened for sure, or no, it didn't. Some people call a hypothesis an opinion. It's not an opinion. You want to make sure that you still have some background knowledge and still some information to kind of describe why you think that way. Then, the best part of science is running an experiment. Now, there's a whole bunch of different types of experiments. What we typically see with like Frankenstein and what we see with movies or Bill Nye the Science Guy, he's got a bunch of test tubes and they're foaming and they're bubbling and they're turning colors. So that's what we call a typical lab. But then we also have what we call like dummy testing or placebo. And we see this a lot with medicines to see whether or not they work or if it's all psychological. Sometimes we have observations or field tests where we might have like game cameras set up in a forest where we might watch migration patterns of like monarch butterflies. And so there's a whole bunch of different kinds of experiments that we'll do in this course and what you'll do throughout your life as it applies to science. And so once we run an experiment, the goal is to get some type of data from it. You kind of have two different types of data. You have what we call a quantitative data, quantity, so it's like a number or a value. And then you can also have qualitative, which is like describing something happened. So maybe you want to see how do different metals rust, and you use words instead of like a percent or instead of some numbering system. And then once you have your data, then you really start to look at your conclusions. What is that data telling you? And not just looking at, the trends or looking at a graph, but what are those numbers within the trends telling us? Why does the graph curve in such a way? Why might we have different ratios? So it's not just, looking at data, but also what's it telling you? And so that brings us to the end of the scientific method, where we look at, all right, a law and a theory in science. Sometimes people say, a theory is just an opinion. But a theory does have evidence behind it. It also is proved most of the time. But a lot of our theories are historical, meaning that we can't go back and say, yup, this happened, or no, it didn't. A law or a fact in science is something that is proven over and over and over again. So some examples of each of these would be like the theory of continental drift, the theory of evolution. And then laws would be like, Newton's 3 laws of motion. Those are things that happen over and over again. They have been proven throughout time. And so as we said, the process of science is not just, we start here and then we end here. Sometimes we have to adjust our thinking. Sometimes we have to change or alter our experiment. Sometimes we have to maybe look at data because we had a weird number and we maybe want to do multiple trials. And so that's why we don't always get to this full-fledged conclusion on the first try. In fact, more oftentimes than not, it takes multiple trials in order to do so. So when we talk about experiments, we have two different main variables that we look at. An independent variable, also known as manipulated, is something that the scientist changes in their experiment. So if I'm running an experiment where I want to see what brand of fertilizer works best, my independent variable is going to be the brand or type of fertilizer. The dependent, also known as responding, is what you actually measure in the experiment. So this is usually a value. It could be inches, it could be degrees, it could be meters. And so if we say the dependent in this experiment would be the growth of plant, it might be in centimeters, it might be in inches. But it's an actual value to see, did what I changed in my independent variable have an impact on the experiment and on my data. All right. And so if we just look at a quick example before we finish up our video here. So if we're just out walking around and we notice, hey, this patch of grass seems to be growing better than the other patch of grass, why might that happen? We just ask ourselves that question. And then let's say that we came up with the idea, well, usually plants need nitrogen, so maybe this soil or this area has more nitrogen for some reason. So then we design our experiment. We want to try to control as many variables as possible. So if you look at the smaller print here, they looked at similar plant density, similar soil type, similar amount of water. We started at the same height. Maybe you mow them or you weed whack them so that they're the same height. And then now you're going to actually do the experiment where you introduce maybe a nitrogen liquid to one side and then you keep the other as is. And then from there, these are your results. So obviously we can look at this and say, it seems like the area on the right has better growth, but we always want data to back us up. I always pick on our social studies teachers. I always say that if you just think so, if you don't have data to back yourself up and you just have opinions, that's social studies. In science, we want data to back ourselves up to really prove our point. Otherwise, it is just opinions and it is social studies. That's kiddingly, of course. And then from there, we come up with our actual conclusion And that really talks about what science is. It is a process, it's not just a start and an end. It's a way to figure out evidence of the world around us. It's not just a bunch of facts, although there are things that go with that. There's formulas, for example, there are units that go with that. And so the big idea is in science, we're going to mess up, we're going to screw up. But it's about altering our experiment and it's about trying to figure out what the answer is and learn from those mistakes.